Chapter 1. When did Morris Claw first appear in London? It is a question which I ask sometimes, and to which I reply, to the best of my knowledge, shortly before the commencement of the strange happenings in the Menzies Museum. What I know of him, I have gathered from various sources, and in these papers, which represent an attempt to justify the methods of one frequently accused of being an insane theorist, I propose to recount all the facts which have come to my knowledge. In some few of the cases, I was personally, though, slightly concerned, but regard me merely as the historian and no account as the principal or even a minor character in the story. My friendship with Martin Coram led, then, to my first meeting with Morris Claw, a meeting which resulted in my becoming his biographer, inadequate though my information unfortunately remains. It was some 3 months after the appointment of Conan to the curatorship of the Menzies Museum that the first of a series of singular occurrences took place there. This occurrence befell one night in August, and the matter was brought to my ears by Conan himself on the following morning. I had, in fact, just taken my seat at the breakfast table when he walked in unexpectedly and sank into an armchair. His dark, clean-shaven face looked more gaunt than usual, and I saw, as he lighted a cigarette, which I proffered, that his hand shook nervously. "There's trouble at the museum," he said abruptly. "I want you to run around." I looked at him for a moment without replying, and then, knowing the responsibility of his position, feared that he referred to a theft from the collection. "Something gone?" I asked. "No, worse," was his reply. "What do you mean, Coram?" He threw the cigarette, unsmoked, into the hearth. "You know, Conway," he said, Conway, the night attendant. "Well, he's dead." I stood up from the table, my breakfast forgotten, and stared incredulously. "Do you mean that he died in the night?" I inquired. "Yes, done for. Poor devil." "What, murdered?" "Without a doubt, Searles. He's had his neck broken." I waited for no further explanations, but hastily dressed, accompanied Coram to the museum. It consists, I should mention, of 4 long, rectangular rooms, the windows of the 2 overlooking South Grafton Square, those of the third giving up the court that leads to the curator's private entrance, and a 4th adjoining an enclosed garden attached to the building. This 4th room is on the ground floor and is entered through the hall from the square, and the other 3, containing the principal and more valuable exhibits, are upon the 1st floor and are reached by a flight of stairs from the hall. The remainder of the building is occupied by an office and the curator's private apartments, and then is completely shut off from the portion open to the public, the only communicating door, an iron one, being kept locked. The room described in the catalogue as the Greek room proved to be the scene of the tragedy. This room is one of the 2 overlooking the square and contains some of the finest items of the collection. The museum is not open to the public until 10 o'clock, and I found, upon arriving there, that their only occupants of the Greek room were the commissionaire on duty, 2 constables, a plain-clothes officer, and an inspector. That is, if I except the body of poor Conway. He had not been touched, but lay as he had been found by Bill, the commissionaire, who took charge of the upper rooms during the day, and indeed, it was patent that he was beyond medical aid. In fact, the position of his body was so extraordinary as almost to defy description. There are 3 windows in the Greek room, with all cases between, and in the gap corresponding to the east window, and just by the door opening in the next room, is a chair for the attendant. Conway lay downward on the polished floor, with his limbs partly under his chair and his clenched fist thrust straight out before him. His head, turned partially to one side, was doubled underneath his breast in a most dreadful manner, indisputably pointing to a broken neck, and his costumere's cap lay somewhere distance away under a table supporting a heavy case of vases. So much was revealed at a glance, and I immediately took blankly to Coram. "What do you make of it?" he said. I shook my head in silence. I couldn't scarce grasp the reality of the thing, Indeed, I was still staring at the huddled figure when the doctor arrived. At his request, he laid the dead man flat on the floor to facilitate an examination, and when we saw that he was greatly cut and bruised about the head and face, and that most of his features were distorted in a most extraordinary manner, almost as though he had been suffocated, the doctor did not fail to notice this expression. Made a hard fight of it, he said. He must have been in the last stages of exhaustion when his neck was broken. My dear fellow, cried Coram, somewhat irritably, what do you mean when you say that he made a hard fight? There could not possibly have been anyone else in this room last night. Excuse me, sir, said the inspector, but there certainly was something going on here. Have you seen the glass case in the next room? Glass case, muttered Coram, running his hand distractedly through his black hair. No, what of a case? In here, sir, explained the inspector. The way into the adjoining apartment. At his words, we all followed and found that he referred to the glass front of a case containing statuettes and images of Egyptian deities. The center pane of this was smashed into fragments, the broken glass strewn the floor and the shelves inside of the case. That looks like a struggle, sir, doesn't it? Said the inspector. Heaven help us. What does it mean? Groaned poor Coram, who could possibly have gained access to the building in the night, or having done so, quitted it again when all the doors remained locked. That we must try and find it, replied the inspector. Meanwhile, here are all the keys. They lay on the floor in a corner of the Greek room. Coram took them mechanically. Bill, he said to the commissioner, see if any of these cases are unlocked. The man proceeded to go around the room. He had progressed no farther than the Greek room when he made a discovery. Here's the top of this unfastened, sir, he said suddenly and excitedly. We hurriedly joined him to find that he stood before a marble pedestal surmounted by a thick glass case containing what Coram had frequently assured me was the gem of the collection, the Athenian harp. It was alleged to be a very ancient Greek workmanship and was constructed of fine gold inlaid with jewels. It represented two reclining female figures in arms thrown above their heads, their hands meeting, and the strings, several of which were still intact, were incredibly fine gold wire. The instrument was said to have belonged to a temple of the palace in an extremely remote age, and at the time it was brought to light, much controversy had waged concerning its claims to authenticity, several connoisseurs proclaiming it was the work of a famous goldsmith of medieval Florence and nothing but a clever forgery. However, Greek or Florentine, amazingly ancient or comparatively modern, it was a beautiful piece of workmanship and of a very great intrinsic value apart from its artistic worth and unique character. I thought so, said the plainclothesman, a clever museum thief. Coram sighed wearily. My good fellow, he replied, can you explain by any earthly hypothesis how a man could get into these apartments and leave them again during the night? Regarding that, sir, remarked the detective, there are a few questions I should like to ask you. In the first place, at what time does the museum close? At 6 o'clock in the summer. What did you do when the last visitor has gone? Having locked the outside door, Bill here thoroughly examines every room to make certain that no one remains concealed. He next locks the communicating doors and comes down into the hall. It was then his custom to hand me the keys. I gave them into poor Conway's keeping when he came on duty at 6:30, and every hour he went through the museum relocking all the doors behind him. I understand that there's a telltale watch in each room. Yes, that in the Greek room registers 4 a.m., so that it was about then that he met his death. He had evidently opened the door communicating with the next room, then containing the broken glass case, but he did not touch the detector, and the door was found open in the morning. Someone must have lain concealed there and sprung upon him as he entered. Impossible. There is no other means of entrance or exit. The 3 windows are iron barred, and they have not been tampered with. Moreover, the watch shows that He was there at 3 o'clock, and nothing larger than a mouse could find shelter in the place. There is nowhere a man could hide. Then the murderer followed him into the Greek room. Might I venture to point out that he had done so, he would have been there this morning when Bill arrived. The door of the Greek room was locked, and the keys were found inside upon the floor. The thief might have had a duplicate set. Quite impossible. But granting the impossible, how did he get in since the hall door was bolted and barred? We must assume that he succeeded in concealing himself before the museum was closed. The assumption is not permissible, in the view of the fact that Bill and I both examined the rooms last night prior to handling the keys to Conway. However, again granting the impossible, how did he get out? The Scotland Yard man removed his hat and mopped his forehead with his handkerchief. I must say, sir, it is a very strange thing, he said, but how about the iron door here? It leads to my own apartments. I alone hold the key. It was locked. A brief examination served to show the exit from any of the barred windows was impossible. Well, sir, said the detective, if the man had keys, he had come from down the hall and the lower rooms. Step down and look, was Coram's invitation. The windows of the room on the ground floor were so heavily protected that it was easy to see that none of them had been opened. Upon my word, exclaimed the inspector, it's uncanny. He couldn't have gone out by the hall door because you say it was bolted and barred on the inside. It was, replied Coram. One moment, sir, interrupted the plainclothesman. If that was so, how did you get in this morning? It was Bill's custom, said Coram, to come around by the private entrance to my apartments, when then entered into the museum together by the iron door into the Greek room and relieved Conway of the keys. There are several little matters to be attended to in the morning before admitting the public, and the other door is never unlocked before 10 a.m. Did you lock the door behind you when you came through this morning? Immediately on finding poor Conway. Could anyone have come through the door in the night, provided he had a duplicate key? No, there is a bolt on the private side, and as we were in the rooms all night from 12 o'clock, yes, the police looked at one another silently. Then the inspector gave an embarrassed laugh. Frankly, sir, I'm completely puzzled. He passed upstairs again, and Coram turned to the doctor. Anything else to report about poor Conway? He said. His face is all cut by the broken glass, and he seems to have had a desperate struggle, although curiously enough his body bears no other marks of violence. The direct cause of death was, of course, a broken neck. And how should you think he come about it? I should say that he was hurled upon the floor by an opponent possessing more than ordinary strength. Thus the physician and was about to depart when there came a knock on the iron door. It is Hilda, said Coram, slipping the key in the lock. My daughter, he added, turning to the detective. Chapter 2. The heavy door swinging open, there entered Hilda Coram, a slim classical figure with regular features of her father and the pale gold hair of her dead mother. She looked unwell and stared about in her apprehensiveness. Good morning, Mr. Searles, she greeted me. Is it not dreadful about poor Conway? And then glanced at Coram. I saw that she held a card in her hand. Father, there is such a singular old man asking to see you. She handed the card to Coram, who in turn passed it to me. It was that of Douglas Glade of the Daily Cable, and had written upon it in Glade's hands the words, to introduce Mr. Morris Claw. I suppose it is all right if Mr. Glade vouches for him, said Coram, but does anybody here know Morris Claw? I do, replied the Scotland Yard man, smiling shortly. He's an antique dealer or something of the kind. Got a ramshackle old place by Waping Old Stairs, sort of a cross between Jamrach's and a rag shop. He's lately been hanging about in the Central Criminal Court a lot. Seems to fancy his luck as an amateur investigator. He's certainly smart, he added grudgingly, but cranky. Ask Mr. Claw to come through, Hilda, said Coram. Shortly afterward entered a strange figure. It was that of a tall man who stooped so that his apparent height was diminished, a very old man who carried his many years lightly, or a younger man prematurely aged. None could say which. His skin had the hue and dirty vellum of his hair. His shaggy brows, his scantly beard were so toneless as to defy classification in terms of color. He wore an archaic brown bowler, smart gold-rimmed pince-nez, and black silk muffler. A long-capped black coat completely enveloped the stooping figure. Edge peeped along toed continental boots. He removed his hat. "Good morning, Mr. Quorum," he said. His voice reminded me of the distant rumblings of empty casks. His accent was wholly indescribable. "Good morning" to the detective. "Mr. Grimsby." "Good morning, Mr. Sallies. Your friend, Mr. Glade, tells me I shall find you here." "Good morning, Inspector," to Miss Quorum. "I already have said good morning." From the lining of the flat-topped hat, he took out one of his small cylinder scent sprays and played its contents upon his high, bald brow. An odor of verbenum filled the air. He replaced the spray in the hat, then the hat on his scantily thatched crown. "There is here a smell of a dead man," he explained. I turned aside to hide my smiles. So grotesque was my first impression of the amazing individual known as Morris Claw. "Mr. Quorum," he continued, "I'm an old fool who sometimes has wise dreams. Crime has been the hobby of a busy life. I have seen crime upon the Gold Coast, where the black fever danced in the air above the murdered like one lingering soul, and I have seen blood flow in Arctic Lapland, where it was frozen up in the red ice almost before it left the veins. Have I your permit to see if I can help?" All of us, the police included, were strangely impressed now. "Certainly," said Quorum. "Will you step this way?" Morris Claw bent over the dead man. "You have moved him," he said sharply. It was explained that this had been for the purpose of a medical examination. He nodded absently. With the aid of a large magnifying glass, he was scrutinizing poor Conway. He examined his hair, his hands, his fingernails. He rubbed long, flexible fingers upon the floor beside the body and sniffed at the dust. "Someone so kindly will tell me all about it," he said, turning out the dead man's pockets. Quorum briefly recounted much of the foregoing and replied to the oddly chosen questions which from time to time Morris Claw put to him. Throughout the duologue, the singular old man conducted a detailed search of every square inch. I think of the Greek room. Before the case containing the harp, he stood peering. "It is here that the trouble centers," he mutters. "Why do I know of such a Grecian instrument? Let me think." He threw his head back, closing his eyes. "Such valuable curios," he rumbled, "have histories, and the crimes they occasion operate in cycles." He waved his hand in a slow circle. "If I but knew the history of this harp, Mr. Quorum." He glanced forward to my friend. "Lots of things, Mr. Quorum. I might spend a night here upon the very spot where the man Conway fell. I could, from the surrounding atmosphere, it is a sensitive plate, recover a picture of the thing in his mind, indicating Conway at the last." The Scotland Yard man blew down his nose. "You snort, my friend," said Morris Claw, turning upon him. "You would snort less if you had waked screaming out of the desert, screaming out with fear of the dripping beaks of the vultures, the last dreadful fear which the mind has known of him who had died of thirst upon the haunted spot." The words of the manner of their delivery thrilled us all. "What is it?" continued the weird old man. "But the odic force, the ether, say it how you please, which carries the wireless message, the lightning. It is a huge, subtle, sensitive plate. Inspiration, that you call bad luck and good luck, all but reflections from it. The supreme thought preceding death is imprinted on the surrounding atmosphere like a photograph. I have trained this," he tapped at his brow, "to reproduce those photographs. May I sleep here tonight, Mr. Quorum?" Somewhere beneath the ramshackle exterior, we had caught a glimpse of a man of power. From behind the thick pebbles, momentarily, had shone out the light of a tremendous and original mind. I should be by most glad of your assistance, answered my friend. No police must be here tonight, rumbled Morris Glaw. No heavy-footed constables filling the room with thoughts of large cooks and small basses must fog my negative. That be arranged? Asked Quorum from the inspector. The men on duty can remain in the hall if you wish, sir. Good, rumbled Mr. Morris Claw. He moistened his brow with venom, bowed uncouthly, and shuffled from the Greek room. Chapter 3. Morris Glaw reappeared in the evening accompanied by a strikingly beautiful brunette. The change of face upon the part of Mr. Grimsby of New Scotland Yard was singular. My daughter Isis, explained Morris Glaw. She assists to develop my negatives. Grimsby became all attentive, leaving 2 men on the duty in the hall, Morris Glaw, his daughter, Grimsby, Quorum, and I went up to the Greek room. Its darkness was relieved by a single lamp. I've had the stones in the Athenian harp examined by a lapidary, said Quorum. It occurred to me that they might have been removed and paste substituted. It was not so, however. No, rumbled Glaw. I thought of that too. No visitor have been admitted here during the day. The Greek room has been closed. It is well, Mr. Quorum. Let no one disturb me until my daughter comes in the morning. Iris Glaw placed a red silk cushion upon the spot where the dead man had lain. Some pillows and a blanket, Mr. Glaw, suggested the suddenly attentive Mr. Grimsby. I think you know, was the reply. They would be saturated with alien impressions. A cushion is so odically sterilized, the etheric storm created by Conway's last mental emotion reaches my brain unpolluted. Good night, gentlemen. Good night, Isis. We withdrew, leaving Morris Glaw to his ghostly vigil. I suppose Mr. Glaw is quite trustworthy, whispered Gorham to the detective. Oh, undoubtedly, was the reply. In any case, he can do no harm. My men will be on the duty downstairs here all night. Do you speak of my father, Mr. Grimsby? Come a soft, thrilling voice. Grimsby turned and met the flashing black eyes of Iris Glaw. I was assuring Mr. Gorham, he answered readily, that Mr. Glaw's methods have several times proved successful. Several times, she cried scornfully. What? He has never failed. Her accent was certainly French. I determined her voice, her entire person, as certainly charming, to which the detective's manners bore witness. I'm afraid I'm not familiar with all his cases, miss, he said. Can I call you a cab? I think you know, she rewarded him with a dazzling smile. Good night. Quorum opened the door of the museum and she passed out, leaving the men on the duty in the hall. Quorum and I shortly afterwards also quitted the museum by the main entrance in order to avoid disturbing Morris Glaw by using the curator's private door. To my friend's study, Hilda Gorham brought us coffee. She was unnaturally pale and her eyes were feverishly bright. I concluded that the tragedy was responsible. Perhaps to an extent, said Quorum, but she is studying music and I fear overworking in order to pass a stiff exam. Quorum and I surveyed the Greek room problem from every conceivable standpoint, but were unable to surmise how the thief had entered, how it left, and why they had fled without its booty. I don't mind confessing, said Quorum, that I am very ill at ease. We haven't had the remotest idea of how the murderer got into the Greek room or how he got out again. Bolts and bars, it is evident, do not prevail against him, and he may have expected repetition of such dreadful business at any time. What precautions do you propose to take? Well, there will be a couple of police on duty in the museum for the next week or so, but after that, we shall have to rely upon the night watchman. The funds only allow for the appointment of 4 attendants, 3 for day and 1 duty for night. Do you think you'll find any difficulty in getting a man? No, replied Quorum. I know of a steady man who will come as soon as we are ready for him. I slept but little that night and was early afoot and around the museum. Iris Glaw was there before me, carrying the red cushion, and her father was deep in conversation with Coram. Detective Inspector Grimsby approached me. "I see you're looking at a cushion, sir," he said smilingly, "but it's not a plant. He's not an up-to-date cracksman. Nothing's missing. You need to be sure of that," I replied. "I do not doubt Mr. Glaw's honesty of the purpose." "Wait till you hear his mad theory, though," he said with a glance outside from the girl. Mr. Coram, Morris Glaw, was saying in his odd, rumbling tones, "My psychic photograph is of a woman dressed all in white." Grimsby coughed, then flushed as he caught the eye of Isis. "Poor Conway's mind," continued Glaw, "is filled with such a picture when he breathes his last great wonder he has for the white woman, and a great fear for the Athenian harp which she carries." "Which she carries," cried Coram. "Some woman took the harp from its case a few minutes before Conway died," affirmed Morris Glaw. "I have much research to make now, and with the aid of Iris shall develop my negative. Yesterday I learnt from the constable who was on night duty at the corner of the square that a heavy Pantechnicon van went driving around at 4 o'clock. It was shortly after 4 o'clock that the tragedy occurred. The driver was unaware that there was no way out, you understand. It is important, I cannot say. It is important. It is such points that matter. We must, however, waste no time. Until you hear from me again, you will lay dry plaster of Paris all around the stand of the Athenian harp each night. Good night, gentlemen." His arms linked in his daughter's, he left the museum. Chapter 4. For some weeks after the mysterious affair, all went well at the Menzies Museum. The new night watchman, a big Scot by the name of John McAllister, seemed to have fallen thoroughly into his duties, and everything was proceeding smoothly. No clue concerning the previous outage had come to light. The police, being clearly at a loss, from Morris Glaw we heard not a word. But McAllister did not appear to suffer from nervousness, saying that he was quite big enough to look after himself. Poor McAllister. His bulk did not save him from a dreadful fate. He was found one fine morning lying flat on his back in the Greek room, dead. As in the case of Conway, the place showed unmistakable signs of a furious struggle. The attendant's chair had been dashed upon the floor with such violence as to break 3 of the legs. A bust of Pallas that had been occupied in a corner position upon the marble pedestal was found to be hurled down, and the top of the case, which usually contained the Athenian harp, had been unlocked, and the priceless antique lay close by upon the floor. The cause of death in McAllister's case was heart failure, an unsuspected weakness of that organ being brought to the light at this inquest, but according to the medical testimony, deceased must have undergone unnaturally violent exertions to bring about his death. In other respects, the circumstances of the 2 cases were almost identical. The door of the Greek room was locked upon the inside, and the keys were found on the floor. From the detector watches the other rooms, it was evident that his death must have taken place about 3 o'clock. Nothing was missing, and the jewels and the harp had not been tampered with. But most amazing circumstance of all, imprinted upon the dry plaster of the Paris, which, in accordance with the instructions of the mysterious absent Morris Glaw, had nightly been placed around the case until the harp were the marks of little bare feet. A message sent through the willing agency of Inspector Grimsby to the waiting abode of the old curio dealer resulted in the discovery that Morris Glaw was abroad. His daughter, however, reported having received a letter from her father which contained the words, "Let Mr. Coram keep the key of the case containing the Athenian harp under his pillow at night." "What does that mean?" asked Coram. "That I am to detach that particular key from the bunch or place them all beneath my pillow?" Grimsby shrugged his shoulders. I'm simply telling you what you told me, sir. I should suspect the man to be an impostor, said Quorum, if it were not for the extraordinary confirmation of his theory furnished by the footprints. They certainly looked like those of a woman. Remembering how Morris Glaw had acted, I sought out the constable who had been on duty at the corner of the Sue Grafton Square on the night of the second tragedy, from which I elicited a fact which, though insignificant in itself, was, when associated with another circumstance, certainly singular. A Pickford traction engine, drawing two heavy wagons, had been driving along the square at 3 a.m. The driver, thinking that he could get out on the other side. That was practically all I learned from the constable, but it served to me thinking. Was it merely a coincidence that at almost the exact hour of the previous tragedy, a heavy Pantechnicon had passed the museum? It's not once in 6 months, the man assured me, that any vehicle but a tradesman cart goes around the square. You see, it doesn't lead anywhere but that the Pickford chap he was rattling by before I could stop him. And though I shouted, he could not hear me, the engine making so much noise, so I just let him drive round and find out for himself. I now come to the event which concluded this extraordinary case, and that, it may be clearly understood, I must explain the positions which we took upon during the nights of the following week, for Quorum had asked me to take a night watch with himself, Grimsby, and Bill in the museum. Bill, the commissionaire, remained in the hall and in the lower room, and it was catalogued as the bronze room. Quorum patrolled the room at the top of the stairs, Grimsby in the next of the Greek room, and I in the Egyptian room. None of the doors was locked, and Grimsby, by his own special request, held the keys of the case in the Greek room. We commenced our vigil on the Saturday night, and I, for one, found it lugubrious business. One electric lamp was left burning in each apartment throughout the night, and I sat as near to that Egyptian room as possible, endeavored to distract my thoughts with a bundle of papers with which I had provided myself. In the next room, I could hear Grimsby walking about incessantly, and, at regular intervals, the scratching of a match as he lit a cigar. He was an inveterate cheroot smoker. Our first night's watchman then was productive of no result, and the 5 that followed were equally monotonous. Upon Grimsby's suggestion, we observed great secrecy in the matter of these depositions. Even Quorum's small household was kept in ignorance of this midnight watching. Grimsby, following out some theory of his own, now determined to dispense altogether with the light in the green room. Friday was intensely hot, and occasional fitful breezes brought with them banks of blank thundercloud, which, however, did not break, and up to that time that we assumed our post at the museum, no rain had fallen. At about 12 o'clock, I looked out into the South Grafton Square and saw that the sky was entirely obscured by a heavy mass of inky cloud, ominous of a gathering storm. Returning to my chair beneath the electric lamp, I took up a work of Mark Twain's, which I had brought as a likely antidote to melancholy or nervousness. As I commenced to read for the 12th time The Jumping Frog, I heard the scratch of Grimsby's match in the next room and knew that he had lighted his 5th cigar. It must have been about 1 o'clock when the rain came. I heard the big drops on the glass roof, followed by the steady pouring of the deluge. For perhaps 5 minutes it rained steadily, and then ceased as abruptly as it had begun. Above the noises of the water rushing down the metal rain gutters, I distinctly detected the sound of Grimsby striking another match. Then, with a mighty crash, came the thunder. Directly above the museum, it seemed as though the heavens had burst and the glass roof rattled as if a shower of stones had fallen, the thunderous report echoing and reverberating hollowly through the building. As the lightning flashed with dazzling brilliance, I started from my chair and stood breathless, with the ever sense on alert for strangely intermingling with the patter of the rain that now commenced to fall again, came a low wailing, like nothing so much as the voice of a patient succumbing to an anesthesia. There was something indefinably sweet, but indescribably weird in the low, mysterious music. Not knowing from whence it proceeded, I stood undetermined what to do. But just as thunder boomed again, I heard a wild cry, undoubtedly proceeding from the Greek room. Springing to the door, I threw it open. All was in darkness, but as I entered, a vivid flash of lightning illuminated the place. I saw a sight which I can never forget. Grimsby lay flat upon the floor by the farther door. But dreadful as this spectacle was, it scarce engaged my attention, nor did I waste a second glance upon the Athenian harp, which lay close beside its empty case. For the figure of a woman draped in a flimsy white was passing across the Greek room. Grim fear took me by the throat, since I could not doubt that what I saw was a supernatural manifestation. Darkness followed. I heard a loud welling cry and a sound as of a fall. Then Coram came running through the Greek room, trembling violently. I joined him, and together we stood looking down at Grimsby. "Good God," whispered Coram, "this is awful. It cannot be the work of mortal hands. Poor Grimsby is dead." "Did you see the woman?" I muttered. I will confess it, my courage had completely deserted me. He shook his head, but as Bill came running to join us, glanced fearfully into the shadows of the Greek room, the storm seemed to have passed, and as we have three frightened men stood around Grimsby's recumbent body, we could almost hear the beating of each other's hearts. Suddenly giving a great start, Coram clutched my arm. "Listen," he said. "What's that?" I held my breath and listened. "It's the thunder in the distance," said Bill. "You are wrong," I answered. "It is someone knocking at the hall entrance." "There goes the bell now." Coram gave a sigh of relief. "Heavens," he said, "I'm no nerves left. Come on, let's see who it is." The three of us, keeping very close together, passed quickly through the Greek room and down into the hall. As the ringing continued, Coram unbolted the door, and there, on the steps, stood Morris Glaw. Some vague idea of his mission flashed through my mind. "You are too late," I cried. "Grimsby has gone." I saw a look of something like anger pass over his large pale features, and then he darted past us and vanished up the stairs. Chapter 5. Having rebolted the door, we rejoined Morris Glaw in the Greek room. He was kneeling beside Grimsby in the dim light, and Grimsby, his face ghastly pale, was sitting up on and drinking from a flask. "I am in time," said Morris Glaw. "He has only fainted." "It was the ghost," whispered the Scotland Yard man. "My God, I'm preparing for anything human, but when the lightning came and I saw the white thing playing the harp." Coram turned aside and was about to pick up the harp, which lay upon the floor, when, "Ah!" cried Morris Glaw, "do not touch it. It is death." Coram started back as though he had been stung as Grimsby's very unsteady got up on his feet. "Turn up the lights," directed Morris Glaw, "and I will show you." The curator went out to the switchboard, and the Greek room became brilliantly illuminated. The ramshackle figure of Morris Glaw seemed to be invested with triumphant majesty. Behind it, the pebbles of his eyes gleamed. "Observe," he said, "I raised the harp from the floor." He did so, and I live. For why? Because I do not take upon it a natural manner by the top. I take it by the side. Conway and McAllister took hold upon it at the top, and where are they? Conway and McAllister? "Mr. Glaw," said Gorham, "I cannot doubt that this black business is all clear to you in very unusual intelligence, but to me it is a profound mystery. I have myself in the past taken up the harp in the way you describe as fatal and without injury." "But not immediately after it had been played upon," interrupted Morris Glaw. "Played upon? I have never attempted to play upon it. Even Had you done so, you might yet have escaped, provided you set it down before touching the top part. Note, please. He ran his long white fingers over the golden strings. Instantly, there stole upon my ears that weird welling music which had heralded the strange happenings of the night. And now, continued our mentor, whilst I, who am cunning, hold it where the lady's gold feet join. Observe the top where the hand would in ordinary rest in holding it. We gathered around him. A needle point? He rumbled, impressively protruding. The player touches it not, but who takes it from the hand of the player dies. By placing the harp again upon its base, the point again retires. Shall I say what is upon that point to drive a man mad like a dog with rabies to stay potent for generations? I cannot. It is a secret buried with the ugly body of Caesar Borgia. Caesar Borgia? We cried in a chorus. Ah, rumbled Morris Glaw, your Athenian harp was indeed made by Paduano Zaloni, the Florentine. It is a clever forge. I have been in Rome until yesterday. You are surprised? I am sorry, for the poor McAllister died. Having perfected, with the aid of Isis, my mind photograph of the lady who played the harp, I go to Rome to perfect the story of the harp. For why? At my house I have records, but incomplete, useless. In Rome I have a friend of so old a family, and once so wicked, I shall not name it. He has recourse to the great Vatican Library, to the annals of his race. There he finds me an account of such a harp. In the priceless parchments it is called a Greek lyre of gold. It is described, I am convinced, I am sure, once the beautiful Lucre Borgia play upon this harp to one is distasteful to her. She says, replace for me my harp. He does so. He is the dead man. God, what cleverness. Where has it lain for generations before your Sir Menzies find it? No man knows, but it has still its virtues. How does the poor Menzies die? Throw himself from his room window, I recently learned. This harp certainly was in his room. Conway, after dashing mad about the place, springs head downward from the attendant's chair. McAllister dies in exhaustion and convulsions. A silence. When? What caused the harp to play? Asked Quorum. Morris Glaw looked hard at him. Then a thrill of new horror ran through my veins. A low moan came from somewhere hard by. Quorum turned in a flash. Why, my private door is open, he whispered. Where do you keep your private keys? Rumbled Glaw. In my study. Quorum was staring at the open door, but seemed afraid to approach it. We have been using the attendant's keys at night. My own are in the study mantelpiece now. I think not, continued the thick voice. Your daughter has them. My daughter, cried Quorum, and sprang to the open door. Heavens, Hilda? Hilda? She is somnambulistic, whispered Morris Glaw in my ear. When certain unusual sounds, such as heavy vehicles at night, reach her in her sleep, how little we know about this phenomenon of sleep. She arises and is common with many sleepwalkers. Always acts the same. Something in the case of Miss Hilda attracts her to the golden harp. She is studying music. She must rest from it. Her brain is overwrought. She unlocks the case and strikes the chords of the harp, relocking the door, replacing the keys. I before have known such cases, then retires as she came, who takes the harp from her hands or raises it, if she has laid it down upon its side, and dies. These dead attendants were both brave fellows, both, for hearing the music they came running, saw how the matter was, and did not awaken the sleeping player. Conway was poisoned as he returned the harp to its case. McAllister, as he took it up from where it lay. Something tonight awoke her ere she could not lock the door. The fright of so awakening made her to swoon. Quorum kindly voiced at the sound of a girl sobbing affrightedly reached us. It was a yell of fear, Mr. Claw, said Grimsby's shameful. You look like a ghost. I understand, rumbled Morris Claw soothingly. As I see her in my sleep, she is very awesome. I will show you the picture Isis had made from my Etheric photograph. I saw it finished earlier tonight. It confirmed me that Miss Hilda, with the harp in her hand, was poor Conway's last thought in life. Mr. Claw, said Grimsby earnestly, you are a very remarkable man. Yes, he rumbled, and gingerly placed in its case the Greek lyre of gold, which O'Donnell Zaloni had brought from Caesar Borgia. From the brown hat he took out his scent spray and squirted verbena upon his heated forehead. That harp, he explained, it smells of dead men. That has been The Tragedies of the Greek Room by Sax Rohmer, published in the book Great Detective Stories, 1928, narrated by Conan Stewart for Tales Reawakened on YouTube.